this call to justice and beloved community, not indifference, this call to justice and beloved community unapologetically and without excuses. As I have discovered in my work with congregations, it has been a bit bewildering to me. I understand it, but it still is a bit bewildering to me when laity and pastors feel reticent to speak about justice in their congregations for fear that it would be upsetting to the peace of the congregation. What kind of peace is that? If somehow the whole prophetic tradition, the whole ministry of Jesus, the message of the gospel for beloved community is somehow or another dismissed or diminished or absent, what kind of peace is that? And is it really shalom? Is it God's peace? Or is it the sort of peace that is willing to settle for injustice and the way in which injustice rages havoc in all our lives and deadens us? So hope is here to bring us to life. In what circumstances are you most comfortable and adept in conflict? In what circumstances are you most uncomfortable and uncertain in conflict? It may be that you can stand before a crowd and speak out, but when it comes talking to some family members, or it could be that you are really adept in dealing with perhaps some issues with neighbors, but when it comes to dealing with matters on your job, that's a whole nother setting. It was my experience that led to my own getting involved in mediation, was to realize that I could lead a march and disrupt in a governmental office and was fine speaking to matters of officials who were responsible for the welfare of what welfare recipients would receive. I was very comfortable in that role. And yet, in my work-related role, I found myself mute too often. And I had to deal with that. And the way in which I began to address that was to get the sort of training that helped me to be in the midst of conflict and be present. Because you don't deal with conflict creatively by avoiding it. The only way the skills of conflict are cultivated are when we find ourselves attending to conflict in the midst of conflict. And my experience was, in terms of getting this training, was when it was happening, I was still in the room, and I was listening deeply, and I was discerning, and I had ways of speaking with others that they could hear things differently than the way in which they had been speaking about the conflicts with which they were dealing. And whatever good I was for anybody else, I rejoice about that. But what I also know is I gave myself a gift to be present in the midst of those places where there could be a creative word offered. My mediation helped this. It, however, carried over into other relationships with colleagues. It carried over with friends. It carried over with family members. It carried over in dealing with justice issues. What this matter of conflict is about is not just the kind of justice issues that we perceive occurring in the news. But I've not been part of your active daily, weekly, monthly life at All Saints, but I think I can say without reservation, you have conflict at All Saints. If you don't have conflict at all, saints, I'd say something's wrong. Or you perceive the reality insufficiently, because conflict exists, not as a problem always, but conflict exists, tensions exist that need to be addressed creatively. And one of the ways to be thinking about the importance of conflict transformation training is how, even in our churches, could we be dealing with conflict more creatively than we have? As some traditions, such as the Quakers, believe, but also many other congregations, the minute you decide we're going to settle this with a vote, you're likely not attending to the underlying realities of the conflict. And I've heard Quaker leaders say, you know, it may take us longer to deal with some things, but when some of you decide to go forward with a 60-40 vote, what you're dismissing is the fact that you still got 40% of those who are very unhappy with the situation. And we may not get 100%. It may be 80-20 or 25-70. But we've created an atmosphere where those who did not prevail have an understanding of consensus as not agreeing, but to say, I join you in the outcome so that we together can see how we move forward creatively. And perhaps I will discover that I was on the wrong side of the matter, or perhaps you will discover you're on the wrong side of the matter. But we have worked together and we go forth together. We don't go forth 80-20 or 25-75. It's these kinds of matters that I think are crucial to dealing with conflict creatively. This matter of how do you deal with friendships creatively and the conflict that exists within them. How do you deal with the reality that some people are not quite aware of why they hold such a negative position about justice, and we perhaps, if we listen deeply and carry forth a conversation rather than simply trying to get them on our side immediately, to help them understand our hearts and to help them perceive that we have listened to their hearts. I was seeing a cartoon this morning where a child had written on the blackboard, none of us are harmed by people getting a living wage. It seems like a simple statement, yet the fights over a living wage prevail, as if somehow it's going to be undermining the whole economic system when clearly it doesn't occur that way. This whole matter of Heather McGhee in her book, as she wrote in terms of the sum of us, the name of the book is The Sum of Us, and Heather McGhee writing that so much resistance to justice is because some people feel that the elevation of another group of people is somehow going to diminish their status. And it's true, and it prevails. Her book is fairly recent, but this was actually put forth by W.B. Du Bois at the turn of the 20th century as he talked about the wages of whiteness. And in this, W.B. Du Bois was saying that so often the low-income white laborers could so benefit by joining black laborers in their struggle. But they resisted joining black laborers because they were taught that somehow to be working with black laborers would diminish your status that you have as a race. So they traded off increased economic benefits that would relate to so many dimensions of their life in order to preserve what others would tell them is the need to uplift yourself as being white and different from those who are black. It's these kinds of things that are occurring. But if we can understand them and work with them creatively, and one of the things I like about Heather McGhee's book is she speaks about how we don't have to be stuck there. We can move forward beyond that in ways in which it's win-win for everybody. I don't think we deal with all the matters of conflict creatively without training. And when I ask the question to students and to pastors, when have you had conflict transformation training in your church? I rarely get an answer. The church is very interested in getting conflicts out of the way, but to help members to do that creatively. Someone I know who does mediation for churches has said, you know, one of the hardest things for us has been to get churches to do this conflict transformation training for themselves. They want us to come in and solve a problem. And usually it has to do with the sexual misbehaviors of clergy. They want us to come in and solve that. But when the problem is solved, they're not interested in having conflict transformation for the issues that were there before we arrived and dealt with this one. We can be a people who are not only conflict adverse, we are conflict training adverse. As if somehow or another just talking about it is going to make it worse. But I have the declaration that attending to conflict can be one of the most satisfying, fulfilling, joyful ways to be beloved community. Because beloved community itself will always have conflict. And how will we be creative in the midst of it and understand that it's not conflict that we have to in some way avoid, but it's the failure to engage that conflict creatively. There's so much I could say about that, but my experience with you over the last now 3 weeks is I run out of time if I try to attend all that. Just another example in terms of little things that don't help. It's when there have been committee meetings and the good intention is there to honor everyone. But I've had so many women to say to me, I put forth an idea and then we move on to talk about everything else. And then when a male puts forth the same idea, it gets the attention of the group. In the black church, we'd say amen. Or at times when people will be trying to creatively identify the different positions in the room, and they put that on a board, and then they put the names underneath it. And what I've said to students, what I've said to pastors, you do that, and you're associating a person's name with a position as if somehow or another, this is where they have landed once and for all. And too often, people feel like they have to defend their position because their name is right there underneath it. And we get into discussions of persuasion rather than listening. Or what is so often said in meetings when people say, that's a good question. That's a good question. And then to have someone ask a question and not hear, that's a good question. What does that mean? Why isn't my question as good as these other questions that have come forth? And no ill intent is meant, but it's the little things that we can do to facilitate the way in which we want to move forward collectively. So perhaps the best in the time that's remaining, I can say regarding this is it would be good to consider some conflict transformation courses that might be offered, not necessarily understanding that the people on staff now have such skills. They may, but to recognize you're living in Metro Atlanta, and there are many people who do have such skills. And you don't need to have 100% participation. It can make a huge difference in a meeting. It can make a huge difference in a congregation if there is some percentage of people who get it. And I have found myself exercising conflict transformation when I have noted how we have moved on from someone who has spoken, identifying the elephant in the room, but we have moved on, and to simply go back to say, you know, Ellen mentioned this some time ago. I don't think we addressed that in any sort of way. Other people around the table, they may not have had that kind of training, but if you have that kind of training, and if you have encouraged others, it may be you're not the only one in the room who recognizes this. Maybe there are 2 of you in the room or 3 of you in the room that helps the process to go forward. And it's the kind of skill you can carry over to a community meeting. It's the kind of skill you can carry over when you're trying to work on issues of justice and beloved community. And that last spiritual discipline is celebrating community. Not celebrating community when we have a victory, but celebrating community because we only go forth creatively when we are experiencing celebration together. Celebration is a form of Sabbath. Clarence Jordan, who wrote the gospel, the Cotton Patch Gospels down in Koinonia, Clarence Jordan has said, you know, I think we have it wrong when we say, and on the 7th day, God rested. He said, God wasn't tired on the 7th day. He said, the meaning of God rested is God delighted in what God had done. And he says, on the 7th day, God zested. Celebration is not just an experience of rest from the work of hope. Celebration is the experience of being zested for the work of hope. It's not time away from the journey. It's what we need for the long journey for justice and beloved community. And so how do we celebrate? How do we not just have an annual celebration, but how is celebration on our calendars? How are we moving forward with the anticipation of celebration? And how do we have the kind of enlivening and revitalizing celebration that we remember on the days when we are seemingly failing at the outcomes that we want, but we have this celebration that lets us know this is who we are called to be. We continue to stand and we go forth together. And at times, I tell you, year after year after year, I attended a celebration after we got no movement on working on a new juvenile justice code for Georgia, but came a 6th year, we were able to celebrate that outcome that many considered to be a model juvenile justice code. But there were many more years when we just basically found ourselves able to smile, to lament, and to say, it's terrible, it's awful. Can you remember what was said? But you know what? We're still here. God has not left this issue of what's happening to children. And we are still here, and we are giving ourselves to it. This is what celebration can be at its best. And to have people come together, it relates to all the other disciplines that have been mentioned. It's the kind of thing that comes out of prayer and the kind of thing that deepens our prayer. It's the sort of thing where the prophets enter the celebration in some form or fashion, and we come to an understanding of the prophets because we ourselves have understood their aliveness in our midst. It's the sort of thing in crossing identity boundaries. I've had celebrations where we've worked on behalf of justice related to matters of children, and in the room, here I was with not only Christians of different ilks, but with Muslims and Jews and Baha'i, and people who likely did not identify themselves with any particular faith, but there was something about us being in that room together in the midst of a Seder event, one tradition, where we were all invited and welcomed, and we found ourselves eating together. One of the most intimate acts around the world that people have, eating together. People who have slept together the night before won't necessarily be seen eating in public together the next day. Eating together. This is where we were, crossing identity boundaries, crossing the identity boundary of one faith tradition, and at the same time offering our hearts for others at table to cross our identity boundaries and the conversations that occurred. Celebration offers such opportunities, and transforming conflict. Celebration, we can name conflicts in the midst of celebration. We can understand that these are matters that have not been resolved, and we can say the conflict did not divide us. We are one as we live with conflict and continue to work on it. There's something about celebration that provides us the opportunity to enact all of these spiritual disciplines in creative ways. And we dare not go forth without having it in a regular aspect of our... We require zest to do this. Oh, Luther. I'm going to end. There is a section, the last of the book, that's in the epilogue. The urgency for justice in beloved community is here and now. The efforts needed for transformation exceed the limits of my body. Still, I see the signs of hope all around me, and I'm emboldened to persevere, even as I see the enormity of the challenges. In this time, on this journey, so many challenges and so many opportunities are mine and yours. I anticipate continuing the journey with you. I know that our fellowship on the journey will make a difference for us and for our being a sign for so many others. I also know that however large our fellowship becomes, it alone will not be enough. What comforts and reassures me is knowing that the abiding presence and love of God on our journey is more than enough. The spiritual wisdom of Victor Hugo speaks to my heart, and I believe every heart, to help us sustain our activism in all the coming days. Courage then and patience. Courage for the great sorrows of life, and patience for the small ones. And then when you have laboriously accomplished your daily task, go to sleep in peace. God is awake. Thank you.
So we have time for one question or comment, and for Luther's response. Does anyone want to offer? It's a perfect question. A little question is a perfect question.
I don't know if it's semantics, but is there a difference between when you're using the term conflict resolution and mediation?
I'm going to set up another difference between conflict transformation, mediation, conflict management, and some other terminology that basically speaks about resolving conflict or doing away with it. These other terms, conflict resolution, conflict management, I think too often speak of conflict as something for us to solve. And I think some of the most creative ways in which I've experienced moving through conflict has been to be in a meeting, to be in dealing with attending a reality of conflict, and things don't get resolved, but they get clarified. And when I have done mediations, either formal or as I'm mediating out of my spirit in the midst of conflict, I have stressed that it's important to not try and address conflict in a meeting. Because when you put that parameter on dealing with conflict, people are in countdown mode. It's a 90-minute meeting. I have 90 minutes to persuade those who don't think like me to begin to think like me. And all of their energy will be going into persuasion. But when folks understand, we may come out of this meeting without any clear sense of this matter being resolved, things get relaxed, and people can hear differently and speak differently. And the speech can change from persuasion to, let me tell you why I think this way, or why I feel this way, or why this is so important to me. And so I think I like the term transformation in that we're talking about how do we, first of all, understand what's behind the conflict, rather than assuming that the conflict is the problem. With most of our issues, conflict is a symptom of a problem, but conflict itself is not the problem. So what are the symptoms that are related to this matter of, with very small churches? I do have 2 more minutes. With very small churches, for example, having them to come together, even though they are only a half-mile apart and in the same denomination and dying, can be a struggle for some denominational leaders, because people are deeply, deeply committed to this church. And why? Well, for some churches, it has to do with a cemetery being there. And they feel like to join this other church, for us to be worshiping in one building, I'm abandoning all of those who have been my family members and all of those I don't know. For some people, they've had important leadership roles in their congregation. And they're not certain that kind of authority and respect will carry over into this new arrangement with another. And in some churches, they just don't like some people in the other church. And the idea of we're going to become one. So, but if the issue gets framed incorrectly, we'll be talking about a lot of things, none of which have to do with some of the deeper reasons that people are opposed. And I'll just say as the last thing, as I'm 15 seconds over, the last thing is to recognize people who are conflict adverse and will do everything to run from a conflict and to try to attend to that creatively. And then people who love conflict, even if they're not necessarily committed to the issue in a strong way, but they just love to have folks in opposition. I had a colleague like that who, when he stirred the rest of the faculty, a smile came across his face because he knew, I got him. That, yeah. We can attend to that, I think, better if we ourselves offer the kind of skills and gifts that enable us to engage the conflict creatively in ways that don't disparage, but move us forward and make us available to the work of hope.
So the thing about spiritual disciplines is we have to practice them. And we have an opportunity to practice celebrating community right after the 11:15 service. We have our first Faith and Justice Collective Luncheon. So please come back for that. We will pray for loaves and fishes. If you haven't registered, please come and we'll work it out. But right after the 11:15 service. And let's thank Dr. Luther Smith one more time for being with us all these weeks.